When the storm struck and the pilot fell unconscious, 12-year-old Ethan had one choice: take control of the plummeting plane or face certain disaster. But could a kid without experience land a crashing aircraft? Or was this a flight doomed from the start? The small Cessna plane rattled violently as it sliced through the storm clouds. Rain pelted the windshield and lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the cockpit in brief, eerie bursts. The pilot, Captain Mike Harris, gripped the yoke tightly, his knuckles white. His co-pilot, Ethan, a young boy, sat wide-eyed in the seat beside him. Ethan was only 12, but he had always dreamed of flying. This was supposed to be a short, scenic flight over the mountains, a birthday gift from his uncle. But now, the dream had turned into a nightmare. "Ethan, listen to me," Captain Harris said, his voice steady but urgent. "We're losing altitude. I need you to stay calm and follow my instructions, okay?" Ethan nodded, though his heart was pounding in his chest. He had never seen Captain Harris look so serious. The plane shook again, and the engine sputtered ominously. The altimeter was dropping fast. "Let me fly the plane," Ethan suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Captain Harris glanced at him, startled. "What?" "No, Ethan, I need you to." Before he could finish, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. The engine died, and the cockpit was plunged into silence except for the howling wind. The plane began to nosedive. "Ethan," Captain Harris yelled, struggling to pull the yoke back. "I need your help. Grab the controls and pull with me." Ethan hesitated for a split second, then reached for the yoke. His hands were small, but he gripped it tightly, mirroring Captain Harris's movements. Together, they pulled with all their strength. The plane's nose slowly began to level out, but they were still descending rapidly. "Good job, kid," Captain Harris said, his voice strained. "Now look at the instruments. Tell me what you see." Ethan's eyes darted across the dashboard. "The altimeter says we're at 3,000 feet and dropping. The airspeed is 120 knots. Okay, Captain Harris muttered, his mind racing. "We're too low to glide to the nearest airport. We're going to have to make an emergency landing." Ethan's stomach churned. "Where? There's nothing but trees down there." Captain Harris didn't answer right away. He was scanning the terrain below, searching for any sign of an open field or road. But the storm made visibility nearly impossible. "Ethan," he said finally, "I need you to take the controls." Ethan's eyes widened. "What? Me? I can't." "You can," Captain Harris interrupted. "You've got this. Just keep the nose level and follow my instructions. I'm going to try to restart the engine." Ethan swallowed hard and nodded. He tightened his grip on the yoke, his heart racing as Captain Harris began flipping switches and adjusting the throttle. The plane was still descending, but Ethan focused on keeping it steady. For a moment, it seemed like they might make it. Then, without warning, Captain Harris slumped forward in his seat, his head hitting the dashboard. "Captain Harris," Ethan screamed. He shook the pilot's shoulder, but there was no response. Captain Harris was unconscious, or worse. Ethan was alone. The plane shuddered as it continued its descent, the storm raging outside. Ethan's mind raced. He was just a kid. He didn't know how to fly a plane. But he had no choice. If he didn't do something, they were going to crash. Okay, he muttered to himself, trying to remember everything Captain Harris had told him during the flight. Keep the nose level. Watch the altimeter. Don't panic. He glanced at the instruments. They were at 2,000 feet now, and the airspeed was dropping. The trees below were getting closer. Too close. Ethan's hands trembled as he adjusted the yoke, trying to keep the plane steady. He could feel the wind buffeting the small aircraft, threatening to send it spiraling out of control. "Think, Ethan, think," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. He remembered Captain Harris mentioning something about flaps. Flaps could slow the plane down, right? Ethan reached for the flap control and pulled it slightly. The plane's nose dipped, and Ethan quickly adjusted the yoke to compensate. "Okay, that's better," he said, though his heart was still pounding. He scanned the terrain below, searching for any sign of a clearing. Through the rain and clouds, he thought he saw a break in the trees, a narrow strip of open land. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. Ethan took a deep breath and began to guide the plane toward the clearing. The altimeter was dropping fast, minus 1,500 feet, 1,200 feet, 900 feet. The trees were so close now that he could see individual branches. Come on," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the clearing. The plane was almost there when a sudden gust of wind hit it from the side, tilting the wings. Ethan fought to keep the plane level, but it was too much. The left wing clipped the top of a tree, sending the plane into a spin. Ethan screamed as the world outside the windshield became a blur of rain and trees. He pulled back on the yoke with all his strength, but it was no use. The plane was going down. The last thing Ethan remembered was the sound of metal screeching and branches snapping as the plane plowed through the trees. Then everything went black. When he opened his eyes, he was still in the cockpit, but the plane was no longer moving. The windshield was cracked, and rain was pouring in through a gap in the roof. Ethan's head throbbed, and his body ached, but he was alive. "Captain Harris," he shouted, turning to the pilot. Captain Harris was still unconscious, his head resting against the dashboard. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt and reached over to check the pilot's pulse. It was weak, but he was still alive. "We have to get out of here," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure if Captain Harris could hear him. He fumbled with the pilot's seatbelt, finally managing to unbuckle it. Then he opened the cockpit door and climbed out into the rain. The plane was a wreck, its wings torn off and its fuselage crumpled. But somehow, they had survived. Ethan dragged Captain Harris out of the plane and into the relative shelter of the trees. The storm was still raging, but at least they were out of the wreckage. "Help!" Ethan shouted, though he knew no one could hear him over the wind and rain. "Somebody, help us." But there was no one around. They were alone in the middle of the wilderness, miles from civilization. Ethan sat down beside Captain Harris, tears mixing with the rain on his face. He didn't know what to do. He was just a kid. But then he remembered something Captain Harris had told him earlier that day. Flying isn't just about controlling the plane. It's about staying calm, thinking clearly, and never giving up. Ethan wiped his tears and took a deep breath. He wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. "Okay," he said, standing up. "I'll find help. I'll save us." And with that, Ethan set off into the storm, determined to find a way out of the wilderness and bring help back for Captain Harris. The rain had not let up. It poured relentlessly, drenching Ethan to the bone as he stumbled through the dense, unforgiving wilderness. His clothes clung to his skin, heavy with water, and his sneakers squelched with every step, sinking into the muddy ground. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of towering trees and tangled underbrush that stretched in every direction. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest burning with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. He couldn't. Captain Harris was counting on him. The crash replayed in his mind like a nightmare. The screech of metal, the snap of branches, the terrifying spin as the plane hurtled toward the ground. He had managed to pull Captain Harris from the wreckage, but the pilot was in bad shape. Unconscious, bleeding, and barely breathing. Ethan had done his best to make him comfortable, propping him up against a tree and covering him with his own jacket to shield him from the rain. But he knew it wasn't enough. Captain Harris needed medical attention, and fast. Ethan had no idea where he was. The storm had thrown them off course, and the crash had left them deep in the wilderness, far from any roads or towns. He had tried to use the plane's radio to call for help, but it was smashed beyond repair. His only option was to go for help himself. So he had set off, armed with nothing but a small flashlight he'd found in the wreckage. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the darkness and rain, but it was better than nothing. He had followed the path of least resistance, weaving through the trees and avoiding the thickest patches of underbrush. Every sound made him jump: the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant howl of the wind. He felt like he was being watched, though he knew it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Hours passed. Or maybe it was only minutes. Ethan couldn't tell. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the storm. His legs ached, and his feet were blistered and sore. His hands were numb from the cold, and his teeth chattered uncontrollably. But he kept going, driven by a single thought: I have to save Captain Harris. Finally, just when he thought he couldn't take another step, he saw it: a break in the trees. A dirt road, muddy and rutted, but unmistakably man-made. Ethan's heart leaped with hope. He stumbled onto the road, his legs nearly giving out beneath him, and looked both ways. There were no signs of life, no cars or houses in sight, but the road had to lead somewhere. Summoning the last of his strength, Ethan began to follow the road. The rain continued to fall, and the wind whipped through the trees, but he barely noticed. His entire focus was on putting one foot in front of the other. He didn't know how long he walked. It could have been minutes or hours, but eventually he saw a light in the distance. At first, he thought it was a trick of the storm, a mirage born of exhaustion and desperation. But as he drew closer, the light grew brighter, and he realized it was real. A farmhouse, small and weathered but warm and inviting, stood at the edge of the road. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a single porch light glowed like a beacon in the darkness. Ethan's heart pounded as he approached the house. He was so close. But what if no one was home? What if they couldn't help? He pushed the doubts aside and climbed the steps to the porch, his legs trembling beneath him. He raised a shaking hand and knocked on the door, the sound barely audible over the storm. For a moment, there was no response. Ethan's heart sank. He knocked again, harder this time, and called out, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. Please, help. The door creaked open, and a man appeared, his face lined with age and framed by a thick gray beard. He wore a flannel shirt and overalls, and his eyes widened in surprise at the sight of the bedraggled boy on his porch. What in the world? The man began, but Ethan cut him off. Please, Ethan gasped, his voice breaking. My uncle, he's hurt. Our plane crashed in the woods. You have to help him. The man didn't hesitate. He grabbed a coat and a flashlight from a hook by the door, and stepped out into the rain. Show me, he said, his voice firm but kind. Ethan led the way, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten as he retraced his steps through the forest. The man, who introduced himself as Mr. Thompson, followed close behind, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. How far is it? Mr. Thompson asked, his voice raised to be heard over the storm. Not far, Ethan replied, though every step felt like a mile. Just a little further. Finally, they reached the crash site. The plane was a mangled wreck, its wings torn off and its fuselage crumpled. Captain Harris was still propped against the tree where Ethan had left him, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Mr. Thompson knelt beside the pilot, checking his pulse and examining his injuries. He's in bad shape, he said grimly. We need to get him to a hospital. Ethan's heart sank. But how? We're miles from anywhere. Mr. Thompson stood and pulled a radio from his belt. I'll call for help. There's a search and rescue team in the area. They've been looking for you. Ethan's eyes widened. They have. Mr. Thompson nodded. Your plane went missing hours ago. They've been searching ever since. As Mr. Thompson radioed for help, Ethan knelt beside Captain Harris, taking the pilot's hand in his own. Hang in there, he whispered. Help is coming. It didn't take long for the rescue team to arrive. They came in a helicopter, its searchlight cutting through the storm as it descended into the clearing. Paramedics rushed to Captain Harris's side, carefully loading him onto a stretcher and carrying him to the helicopter. Ethan watched, his heart in his throat, as the paramedics worked to stabilize the pilot. One of them turned to Ethan and said, "You're coming too, kid. We need to get you checked out." Ethan nodded and climbed into the helicopter, his eyes never leaving Captain Harris. The ride to the hospital was a blur of noise and motion, but Ethan barely noticed. All he could think about was the pilot, his mentor, his friend. At the hospital, Captain Harris was rushed into surgery, and Ethan was taken to a room to be examined. He had a few cuts and bruises, but otherwise, he was unharmed. The doctors gave him a blanket and a cup of hot chocolate, but he barely touched it. He couldn't relax, not until he knew Captain Harris was okay. Hours passed. Ethan sat in the waiting room, staring at the clock on the wall. The storm had finally passed, and the first light of dawn was creeping through the windows. Just as Ethan was beginning to lose hope, a doctor emerged from the operating room. "He's going to be okay," the doctor said, a smile on his face. "He's stable and resting. You saved his life, young man." Ethan's eyes filled with tears of relief. He followed the doctor to Captain Harris' room, where the pilot lay in a hospital bed, his head bandaged and an IV in his arm. He was still unconscious, but his breathing was steady and his color had returned. Ethan sat beside the bed, taking Captain Harris's hand in his own. "You did it, kid," the pilot murmured, his voice weak but full of pride. "You saved us." Ethan shook his head. "I couldn't have done it without you. You taught me how to stay calm and never give up." Captain Harris smiled. "You're a natural, Ethan. Maybe one day you'll be a pilot yourself." Ethan grinned. "I think I'd like that." And as the two of them sat there, surrounded by the hum of hospital machines, Ethan knew that he had faced his greatest fear and come out stronger on the other side.